You won't believe what was happening in households across the country. From secret lives to political clashes, these scandalous causes of divorce reveal a time when we live in other ways than now. Find out what the main reasons for divorce were back then. Watch the video to the end and tell us what has changed now. Infidelity and secret affairs. In the 1970s, infidelity in marriage wasn't just a secret to be kept. Male unfaithfulness was often seen as something normal. Many men had affairs, and their wives knew about it but remained silent. Back then, this was considered typical male behavior, and many women endured such relationships to keep their families together. Imagine how it was. A wife knows her husband is cheating, but file for divorce? No, at that time, infidelity wasn't seen as a sufficient reason for divorce. Many women simply couldn't find another way out, as society expected them to preserve the marriage no matter what. The shocking part? Some wives knew about their husband's affairs but continued to live with them out of fear of judgment. It was much harder for women to leave than we can imagine today, but this wasn't the only reason for divorce. Alcohol and drug problems. In the 1970s, alcoholism and drug abuse were destroying not only lives, but also marriages. Imagine this: a husband goes on a drinking binge or gets hooked on drugs, but the wife stays with him anyway. At the time, it was expected that a wife should support her husband, even if he was destroying himself and their family. Many women simply couldn't leave. Society expected them to be patient and loyal. Even in court, these issues weren't always taken seriously. Drug use was often seen as a personal problem, not a valid reason for divorce. As a result, many wives kept enduring these situations, either out of fear or judgment, or because they lacked the support to get divorced. Divorce rates were rising, but issues with alcohol and drugs were often ignored. Despite the devastating effects on families, worse still, women were often blamed for not helping their husbands enough. The next reason for divorce affected even more people. Financial problems. In the 1970s, financial difficulties often led to the breakdown of marriages. Imagine this: a husband loses his job or can't manage the debt, and the whole family suffers. Many men simply disappeared, abandoning their families to avoid financial responsibility. Wives were left to survive on their own, with no support. The laws at that time weren't on women's side either. After a divorce, many were left without money or property, as there was little fairness in dividing assets. If the husband controlled the finances, it was extremely difficult for women to get anything after the split. Left with children and no means, they had to start their lives over from scratch. Marriages crumbled due to debt, unemployment, and rising costs, but it was often the women who bore the brunt of the consequences. And what happened in court only made things worse. The next reason for divorce will reveal even darker secrets. Sexual incompatibility. In the 1970s, divorce due to sexual incompatibility was a true sensation. At that time, such issues were rarely discussed publicly, especially in marriage. Society expected that family problems would stay behind closed doors. But everything changed when women began to openly speak about their right to sexual satisfaction. This sparked heated debates. Before that, most people believed women should simply endure. Many couples divorced because their intimate relationships didn't work out, making it one of the most unexpected reasons for separation. Open conversations about sex became more common, and society could no longer ignore them. It was a shock for many women to realize that they could demand happiness in this area instead of quietly accepting dissatisfaction. And this was just one of many reasons for divorces in those years. Even more people split up for the next reason: jealousy and control. In the 1970s, jealousy often became a silent reason behind many divorces. Imagine a husband gradually increasing his control over his wife, limiting her freedom, forbidding her from socializing with friends or working. Back then, such actions could be justified as caring for the family. Men would claim they were simply protecting their wives, but in reality, it was control, and it was this control that eroded relationships. Jealousy frequently led to constant accusations of infidelity, even when no cheating had actually occurred. Many marriages fell apart because one spouse couldn't trust the other. Families suffered when every step, every conversation with someone outside the marriage was perceived as a betrayal. This kind of jealousy morphed into toxic behavior that could not be ignored, and the more control there was, the quicker the marriage disintegrated. Another reason for divorces also emerged around that same time: the Feminist Movement. In the 1970s, the feminist movement didn't just change society, it transformed marriages. Imagine, women suddenly began to realize that they deserved equal rights and respect in relationships. They no longer wanted to endure justice, stay at home, and obey. For many, this was a revelation. They felt they could live differently, freely, without constant control. Many men saw these changes as a threat to their authority in the family. Picture a husband used to his wife being dependent, and suddenly, she's demanding equality? This often led to conflicts and, ultimately, divorces. Women realized they deserved better and walked away. These changes sparked a wave of divorces across the country, and it was just the beginning of greater shifts that further dismantled traditional marriages. But there was yet another problem that few people were paying attention to: emotional coldness. In the 1970s, emotional coldness in marriage was a common but rarely discussed cause of divorce. Imagine a husband working all day, coming home, staying silent, and showing no affection. At the time, this was seen as normal male behavior. Men weren't expected to share their emotions, yet they were the providers, and that was considered enough. However, women began to realize that relationships required more than just financial support. Emotional closeness was equally important. When that was missing, marriages crumbled. A man could be a good father and provider, but if he didn't offer warmth, his wife felt isolated and lonely. This realization led many to file for divorce specifically due to the lack of emotional support. Women stopped accepting husbands as mere walls in their lives, and this became a driving force behind major changes in relationships. What are your thoughts on this issue? Differing political views. In the 1970s, political disagreements often tore marriages apart. It was a turbulent time. Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement. Imagine one spouse supports the war while the other is against it. Such opposing views could turn into a ticking time bomb in a relationship. With so much change happening in the country, even a simple family dinner could escalate into a heated political debate. Couples clashed over social movements. For instance, the fight for African American rights sparked intense arguments at home. Some embraced the changes, while others clung to the old ways. This created deep fractures in marriages where spouses could no longer understand each other. Many couples couldn't withstand the pressure, and political disputes became a leading cause of divorce. In those years, politics was no longer just a topic of conversation. It became a reason for separation. But here's where you might be surprised by the next reason: childcare and housework. In the 1970s, the issue of childcare and housework became an increasingly tense point in marriages. Women were entering the workforce en masse, but husbands still expected them to handle all the domestic duties. Imagine a wife working a full day, then having to take care of the kids, cook dinner, and clean the house. This created immense stress, as many men were not willing to help. Many divorces stemmed from this conflict. Women grew exhausted from the double burden, while men were resistant to changing the traditional roles. Husbands' refusal to take on part of the responsibilities for childcare and housework often became the last straw. These conflicts tore marriages apart, and more women opted for divorce, feeling they shouldn't have to carry the load alone. Do you think society has changed since then? And what do you believe is the most common cause of divorces today?